They laughed at her torn shoes at the billionaire's gala, whispered, pointed, mocked. But when the wealthy matriarch named her sole heir, the room went silent. The girl who gave her last coat to a stranger inherited everything. Because kindness, not cruelty, is what heaven rewards. Welcome to our channel Truth Turn Stories, where real-life truths turn into powerful lessons. If this story speaks to you, subscribe and support the journey. Sometimes the most beautiful moments begin with the cruelest judgments. Sometimes kindness whispers your name in rooms where wealth shouts the loudest. And sometimes a pair of torn shoes becomes the doorway to a destiny no one saw coming. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow across the grand ballroom, illuminating silk gowns and diamond necklaces that sparkled like captured starlight. The city's wealthiest elite mingled beneath vaulted ceilings, their laughter light and careless, their champagne glasses catching the light with every gesture. But then the enormous oak doors swung open, and every conversation stopped. Every head turned. Every eye found her. Clara stood at the entrance, small and trembling, clutching a crumpled invitation in hands that had known more work than luxury. Her coat was worn thin at the elbows, the fabric faded from too many winters. Beneath it, a simple dress hung modestly, clean but clearly not designer. And then there were the shoes. Oh, those shoes. Torn at the seams, mud-stained from walking miles because she couldn't afford the bus. They told a story the crowd didn't want to hear, a story of struggle and survival, of dignity held together by sheer will. The whispers started like a slow poison spreading through the room. One woman in a glittering diamond necklace leaned toward her companion, her perfectly painted lips curling into a smirk. A man in a tailored tuxedo chuckled behind his hand, his eyes sliding over Clara with open disdain. The laughter followed, quiet at first, then bolder. Someone pointed. Someone else whispered loud enough for Clara to hear. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the urge to run nearly overwhelming. But something deeper held her still. She lifted her chin. She tightened her grip on that invitation. She had been invited here not by accident, but by intention, by someone who had seen her worth when the world looked away. Weeks ago, on a rainy street corner, Clara had found an elderly woman sitting alone on a bench, soaked and shivering. No one else had stopped. The crowd rushed past, umbrellas tilting away, eyes avoiding the inconvenience of compassion. But Clara stopped. She gave the woman her only coat. She bought her tea with the last few dollars in her pocket. She sat and listened to her story, not knowing she was speaking to Mrs. Whitmore, the matriarch of the wealthiest estate in the city. The old woman had looked into Clara's eyes and seen something rare, something precious, something the people in this ballroom had long forgotten. And so she had written Clara's name on an invitation, in her own trembling handwriting, and sent it with a single instruction: "Come as you are." Now, as the mockery swirled around her like smoke, Clara stood her ground. She didn't know why she was here. She didn't know what tonight would bring. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty: kindness had brought her to this moment. And kindness would carry her through. Then, cutting through the cruel whispers, a voice spoke with warmth and respect. A butler stepped forward, his smile genuine, his eyes kind. "Miss Clara," he said gently, his words echoing across the silent ballroom, "Mrs. Whitmore has been waiting for you." The room fell deathly silent, and in that silence, everything began to change. Clara's footsteps echoed softly against the marble floor as she followed the butler through hallways lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors and golden-framed mirrors that reflected a world she didn't recognize. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Behind her, the whispers continued, following like shadows she couldn't shake. She didn't belong here. Every glance, every raised eyebrow, every barely concealed smirk made that abundantly clear. The butler led her to a table at the far edge of the ballroom, tucked away near the corner where the light didn't quite reach. It was a table for the forgotten, the unwanted, the charity cases. Clara sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the white linen tablecloth to avoid the stares that still burned into her back. The voices around her weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. A woman in emerald silk leaned toward her companion, her laughter sharp and cutting. "Can you believe she actually came? In those shoes?" Another voice chimed in, dripping with mock concern. Someone should tell her this isn't a homeless shelter. The words stung, each one landing like a stone against her chest. But then Clara remembered something. She remembered Mrs. Whitmore's gentle voice on that rainy street corner. Fragile but filled with certainty. "True wealth is measured by the heart, dear child. Never forget that." Clara held onto those words like a lifeline. She straightened her shoulders. She lifted her eyes. And she watched. Throughout the evening, Clara observed the guests with a quiet clarity they would never suspect. She saw the cold smiles that never reached their eyes. She heard the empty compliments exchanged like currency, words without meaning, flattery without feeling. She watched them obsess over titles and status, competing in invisible games where no one ever truly won. And beneath all the glittering jewelry and designer gowns, Clara saw something else. She saw loneliness. She saw emptiness. She saw people surrounded by everything and connected to nothing. They had wealth beyond measure, yet their eyes held a hollowness that no amount of money could fill. Then it happened. A young server, barely out of her teens, stumbled while carrying a tray of champagne glasses. The tray tilted. The glasses crashed to the floor in an explosion of crystal and golden liquid. The room erupted. Laughter, cruel and immediate, filled the air. Someone clapped mockingly. Another shouted for the manager. The girl stood frozen, her face red with shame, tears welling in her eyes. No one moved to help. No one offered a kind word. They simply stared, entertained by her humiliation. But Clara stood. She walked over calmly, knelt beside the girl, and began picking up the broken pieces. "Hey," Clara whispered, her voice soft and steady. "You're doing great. Don't let them steal your light." The girl looked up, tears spilling over, and smiled through her pain. It was a smile of gratitude, of recognition, of unexpected grace. And in that moment, Clara remembered exactly why she had come. Not to fit in, not to impress anyone, but to honor a promise made to a kind woman who had seen her heart. Then the lights dimmed, the room quieted, and Mrs. Whitmore appeared on stage, frail but radiant, her presence commanding a respect that silence alone could give. She smiled softly, her eyes scanning the crowd until they found Clara. And then she spoke words that made Clara's breath catch, and the entire room leaned forward in stunned anticipation. Mrs. Whitmore's voice, though frail with age, carried across the ballroom with the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. Every conversation stopped. Every glass was set down. Every breath was held. "Tonight," she said slowly, her hands gripping the podium for support, "I name my sole heir." The room erupted in barely contained excitement. Gasps rippled through the crowd like waves. Greedy eyes turned immediately toward the front rows, where Mrs. Whitmore's relatives sat in their designer suits and borrowed smiles. Her son straightened his tie, confidence gleaming in his eyes. Her nieces exchanged knowing glances, already calculating their fortunes. The lawyers leaned forward, pens poised, ready to make it official. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment they had dressed up for, schemed for, pretended kindness for. But Mrs. Whitmore's gaze didn't fall on any of them. Her eyes, soft and glistening with emotion, searched the crowd until they found a small figure seated alone in the shadows. Clara. "To the girl with torn shoes and a golden heart," Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice trembling but resolute, "I leave everything." Silence, pure, absolute, suffocating silence, and then it shattered. Chaos exploded through the ballroom like a storm breaking loose. Voices shouted over each other in disbelief and rage. "This is a mistake," someone yelled. "She's a nobody," another screamed. The son jumped to his feet, his face red with fury. The nieces clutched each other, their expressions twisted in shock and betrayal. Lawyers scrambled, flipping through documents, searching for loopholes, for explanations, for anything that made sense. But Mrs. Whitmore stood firm, her small frame radiating a strength that silenced the room once more. "Let me tell you why," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade of truth. She turned fully toward Clara, her eyes filled with tears and gratitude. "Weeks ago, I sat alone on a rainy street corner. I was cold, I was forgotten, I was invisible. I wanted to see if anyone at all, would stop for an old woman in need. Hundreds of people walked past me. Businessmen, socialites, even some of you in this very room." Her gaze swept across her relatives, and they looked away, shame creeping into their faces. "But this girl," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice breaking with emotion, "this beautiful girl stopped. She didn't know who I was. She didn't expect anything in return. She gave me her only coat. She spent her last few dollars to buy me tea. She sat with me and listened to my story as if I mattered, as if I was worth her time." Tears streamed down Clara's face. She shook her head slowly, overwhelmed, unable to speak. She hadn't done it for this. She hadn't done it for recognition or reward. She had done it because it was right, because it was kind, because love had compelled her when the world had turned away. Mrs. Whitmore smiled through her own tears. "I tested all of you," she said, her voice steady now, filled with quiet power, "and only she passed." The room stood frozen, caught between disbelief and the undeniable truth of what goodness looks like when no one is watching. And in that moment, everything changed. The estate was hers. The fortune, the legacy, everything Mrs. Whitmore had built over a lifetime now belonged to Clara, the girl with torn shoes and a heart that refused to harden. The lawyers finalized the papers. The keys were handed over. The mansion with its sprawling gardens and marble staircases stood waiting. But Clara didn't change, not in the way the world expected. She didn't buy designer clothes or expensive cars. She didn't host lavish parties or surround herself with luxury. Instead, she did something no one saw coming. She transformed the mansion into a shelter for those society had overlooked, the homeless, the struggling, the forgotten, the invisible. Room by room, she opened the doors to people who had never known such warmth. She filled the grand dining hall with tables where anyone could sit and share a meal. She turned the library into a learning space where people could read, study, and dream again. And she wore her torn shoes for one more week, not out of necessity, but out of intention, until she could afford new ones for everyone who walked through her doors. The same guests who had mocked her that night at the gala now came knocking, their voices suddenly sweet, their smiles suddenly warm. They wanted favors, they wanted access, they wanted to be close to the fortune they had once dismissed. But Clara welcomed them with grace. She didn't shame them, she didn't turn them away. Instead, she taught them. She invited them to serve alongside her, to see the faces of the people they had ignored, to understand that wealth without compassion is just emptiness dressed in expensive clothes. Some left uncomfortable, but some stayed, and some were changed. Months later, Mrs. Whitmore passed peacefully in her sleep, a soft smile on her lips, knowing her wealth had finally found its true purpose. Her memorial service filled the largest cathedral in the city. Hundreds gathered, but it was Clara who stood at the podium, her voice steady, her heart full. "Mrs. Whitmore didn't give me riches," Clara said, her words echoing through the sacred space. "She gave me something far greater. She gave me a reminder that how we treat the least among us defines who we truly are." Her voice cracked with emotion, but she continued. "She taught me that kindness is the only currency that matters, that love is the only legacy worth leaving behind." The room wept. Tears fell from the eyes of the wealthy and the poor alike, united in a moment of shared truth. And in that moment, the world learned a lesson it desperately needed. Kindness is never wasted. Humility is never forgotten. And love, given freely, without expectation or agenda, always returns as blessing. Clara had walked into that gala with nothing but torn shoes and a good heart. And she walked out with everything that truly mattered. Not because she sought it, but because she lived it. Because she chose compassion when the world chose cruelty. Because she saw worth where others saw weakness. And because she understood that the greatest inheritance we can ever receive is the chance to love others well. That is the legacy that never fades. That is the wealth that never runs out. That is the story that changes everything.